Ernest Sosa is someone who needs no introduction to a group like this. Ernest Sosa is Board of Governors Professor of Philosophy at Rutgers. He, before that, was Professor of Philosophy, and then before that, Distinguished Visiting Professor from 1998 to 2007. Professor Sosa was at Brown University for many years, at Brown from 1964 to 2007. From 1981 to 2007, Professor Sosa was the Romeo Elton Professor of Natural Theology and Professor of Philosophy. And he was, in the 70s, for some time, the chairman of the Brown Philosophy Department. He has been the subject of an important critical book about his work, edited by John Greco, which appears in the series Philosophers and Their Critics. Ernest Sosa and His Critics was elected in 2001 to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He was elected in 2002 by the Oxford Philosophy faculty to give the distinguished John Locke lectures at Oxford in 2005. A 2-volume work, Apt Belief and Reflective Knowledge, published by Oxford University Press, contains the Locke lectures as its first volume, A Virtue Epistemology, which appeared in 2007, and Reflective Knowledge as its second volume was published in 2009. He was elected in 2008 to give the 3 Karras lectures at meetings of the American Philosophical Association, which were delivered in Chicago in February of 2010. He was awarded the Rescher Prize by the University of Pittsburg for contributions to systematic philosophy in 2010. And I noted, actually studied under Nicholas Rescher as well in the 1960s, and was awarded the Quinn Prize by the American Philosophical Association in 2010. And I should note as well that Professor Sosa has a very engaging chapter about Alvin Plantinga's epistemology in the book on Alvin Plantinga, edited by Dean Peter Baker. So we're delighted that you would join us, Professor Sosa. So we'll ask you to deliver your formal response, and we'll have some brief discussion about Professor Sosa's response before we break for lunch.
Thank you. So let's see, is this on? Can you hear me okay? Okay. So I'm delighted to be here and to be commenting on Al Plantinga. I was a professor of natural theology at Brown for many years, but I didn't actually teach. That was just a title. In fact, the closest I've come to thinking and writing about theology is thinking and writing about Al's work. So today, Al's paper has 2 main parts. I won't assume that everybody will have read what I sent around, so I'll give much of it, though not all of it. So this will take probably 45 minutes, something in that order. So Al's paper has 2 main parts. The first considers whether belief in God is rational. The second argues that atheist naturalism is self-defeating and hence irrational. My comments will begin with 2 corresponding parts, and then 2 later parts will reflect more broadly on the issues and the reasoning. So I'm going to skip a bunch of stuff here. So I'm going to pose an issue of coherence, first of all, for the theist who solves the problem of evil by invoking our ignorance. So how can the theist, such a theist, coherently plead ignorance in defense against evil while claiming knowledge or sufficiently justified belief when it comes to God's epistemic benevolence in giving us these faculties that are so effective in getting us to the truth? So item A of the handout, let R stand for the proposition that our cognitive faculties are reliable, N for naturalism, TH for theism, and E for the proposition that we and our cognitive faculties have developed in the way specified by the contemporary scientific theory of evolution. The theist might then respond as follows. T, probability of R on E is very low, and since the probability of E on N is higher than the probability of E on theism, therefore the probability of R on N will be lower than the probability of R on theism, even if worries arising from the problem of evil make the probability of R on theism lower than we might have thought. Now that response would seem weak to me, given the content of the evil-based critique, which argues that there's a plausible parity between the following two claims. Claim V, God's preferences must be quite a mystery to us, given our ignorance of the infinite value package and the possible trade-offs and organic wholes that may be involved in that, so far as we know. Therefore, we cannot have any very good reason to claim that He, God, just would not have permitted the seemingly pointless suffering that we know is plentiful out there, as with the little doe that burns to death in a forest fire, where I'm alluding to William Rowe. And now compare with V.E., God's preferences, again, must be quite a mystery. And now the conclusion would be, therefore, we cannot have any very good reason to claim that He would have ensured that we would have epistemically reliable faculties. But if these are on a par, then anyone who opts for the ignorance-based defense against the argument from evil cannot plausibly make the claims in T above in the defense. How can he be sure enough that he has a good enough handle on what the probability of R on TH is to say any of the things he says about it about that probability in the defense, T? Item B, what is more, I wonder if the plausible parity between V and E does not also lead to a line of thought more threatening yet for theists who both endorse a V-based defense against evil, ignorance-based defense against evil, and wish to argue as does Al. And the problem now would emerge as follows with DT. The probability of R on theism is at best approximately 50% or else inscrutable. And this gives us, relevant theists, a defeater for our belief in R. So now we need a defeater, and how can we get it while avoiding vicious circularity? I mean, the basic problem is as soon as you have a defeater for R, you're in trouble vis-a-vis vicious circularity, because what are you going to appeal to defeat that defeater? The problem here for the theist is a very close match for the problem to be posed by Al for the naturalist. The heart of the problem for both is that once one has a defeater for R, there's no apparent way to defeat that defeater while avoiding vicious circularity. While awaiting Al's no doubt instructive response, let me point to a further worry. It's not quite clear to me how Al's reasoning is meant to address the question that he raises as follows. Who's right when the atheist and the theist accuse each other of irrational belief? The answer proposed by Al is that the theist is rational if and only if theism is true. But that's going to help only if we can take theism to be true or to be false. In order to complete the answer, then, we would have to address the question of theism. So I wonder, can we properly address that question by reasoning theologically or just by flat-out assertion? Can we really do so even as we confront an atheist challenge to the rationality of our relevant beliefs and reasonings? Okay, again, raising a question for Al. Now here's, I'm turning to the second theme in the paper, is atheist naturalism, more specifically, self-defeating? So now we turn to a very different defense of natural theology, a further imaginative and original turning of the tables. I mean the way in which Al has turned the momentum of religion's enemies against them, using their own strategy to trip them onto their own sword. And that strategy is one that on the part of religion's enemies, such as Nietzsche, Freud, and Marx, that part of the paper I skipped. But I think what Al is doing is, in effect, turning that strategy against the enemies of religion. So how is that supposed to work? One, planting as our target is the naturalist, the atheist, materialist believer in evolution. Such naturalism is self-defeating because it imports a defeater for naturalist belief in their own epistemic reliability. So, naturalists cannot coherently believe the following: our cognitive faculties are reliable. According to Al, moreover, epistemic reliability is to be understood so that, and I quote, our cognitive faculties are reliable if and only if they produce an appropriate preponderance of true beliefs in this and nearby possible worlds. So I'll interpret both of the statements above. Cognitive faculties are reliable, and they're reliable if and only if they produce an appropriate preponderance of truth. I'll interpret those as having existential import. So the first one says we do have cognitive faculties which produce our beliefs, etc., and similarly for the second. So item C. Plantinga adopts the abbreviations we have stipulated as follows: R for the proposition that our faculties are reliable, N for naturalism, and E for the proposition that we and our cognitive faculties have developed in the way specified by evolution. Given those stipulations, here's the argument. A, probability that our faculties are reliable given N and E is low. B, anyone who accepts N and E and sees that A is true has an undefeated defeater for R. Anyone who has an undefeated defeater for R has an undefeated defeater for any of the beliefs that she holds, which would have to come from R. Therefore, anyone who accepts N and E and sees that A is true has an undefeated defeater for their belief of N in particular, and hence cannot rationally believe it. Item D. Because he takes A to be the most controversial premise, Al gives it his fullest defense as follows. A, the naturalist is by definition a materialist. What kind of thing is a belief, an act of believing? For a materialist, it would have to be a long-standing event or structure in your brain or nervous system. Then, of course, that has neurophysiological properties and propositional contents, being a belief. When true, beliefs are true in virtue of the truth of their propositional contents. Given B, given that a belief is this material physical structure, long-standing event, given that, beliefs will even partially cause actions only in virtue of their neurophysiological properties and not in virtue of their contents. And so natural selection weeds out beliefs that are maladaptive. However, natural selection cannot be expected to weed out processes that produce false belief. And that's because the truth value of a belief does not matter to its adaptivity. What matters is only the properties by virtue of which the belief enters the causal order. And these, for the materialist, are only its neurophysiological properties and not at all its content. So that's my way of rendering Al's argument. And the critique argues via two commitments of the naturalist, to evolution and to materialism. However, we can argue, I suggest, more simply, no less cogently, that naturalism is self-defeating while dispensing with any reference to evolution. Item E of the handout. And the new argument would go like this. A, our cognitive faculties are reliable if and only if they produce an appropriate preponderance of true beliefs in this and nearby possible worlds. That's also a premise in Al's argument. B, our cognitive faculties will produce an appropriate preponderance of true beliefs in this and nearby possible worlds only if the truth, and hence the content, of our beliefs can enter the causal order. That is, the dispositions that constitute our cognitive faculties must favor truth over falsity in their belief production, so that they must be sensitive to the contents and indeed to the truth value of the beliefs produced. So if they're going to discriminate in favor of truth, truth has to enter into the operation of these faculties or dispositions so that their operation can favor truth over falsity. So content has to enter because truth would be truth of content. C, for a materialist, beliefs enter the causal order only in virtue of their neurophysiological properties and not at all in virtue of their contents. So therefore, for a materialist, our cognitive faculties are not reliable. And hence, for a naturalist, our cognitive faculties are not reliable. So, well, we all know what Al's argument looks like, so I won't repeat it here. But if my suggestion is correct, then what we can do is excise E and retain an equally good or bad argument as the one that Al proposes. However, not all naturalists are so radically reductive as Plantinga's materialist is supposed to be. There are, of course, various conflicting proposals for how we should understand mental causation and for how to address attendant problems such as that of exclusion. According to one attractive option, the special sciences host causal explanations that would be put in doubt by the same features that are said to make trouble for mental causation. Any premises that yield epiphenomenalism are thus reduced to absurdity. One might thus seek a more flexible account of causal explanation that would accommodate the causal within less fundamental levels than that of physics or even biology. We need causation also in psychology and even in sociology, in the special sciences. Even with no such account in hand, why think that the only way to be a materialist is the radically reductive way? Good naturalists might find understanding, scientific causal understanding, not only in physics and biology, but also in psychology and other special sciences, and even in common sense explanations. Item F, accordingly, only those on one side of the several-sided controversy over mental causation would be affected directly by the anti-naturalist argument that attributes to the naturalist such as reductive commitment. Those of us who reject any such radical reduction or who suspend judgment on the matter need not worry just yet. We can contemplate the argument with equanimity while noting that it may simply provide a further reason to be wary of radical reductionism, a radical view that makes trouble for trust in our own epistemic reliability, and we'd be able to resist calmly while still retaining our commitment to a modest naturalism so long as it avoids radical reduction. Now, one might try to save the argument from evolution. That might be not quite the right way to put it. I mean, one might try to develop an argument from evolution by modifying Plantinga's argument in a different way. So this would be now an alternative way to modify Al's argument. Suppose we excise not evolution but materialism from the argument. The resulting argument might then be acceptable to moderate naturalists. And how might that go? Well, we would need to conclude that our belief-forming dispositions are unreliable without premising radical materialist reductionism. So that's what we are excising now from the argument. Although I cannot stop to consider in full detail how that might be done, I'd like to suggest some preliminary worries for trying to go that way, dispense with the materialist idea. In the first place, those of our beliefs bearing on our survival are likely to be reliably formed, given how the truth of such beliefs will matter. This is not to say that the truth of our beliefs must matter with apodictic necessity in any possible world. Our claim is more modest, but would still be telling if true. The claim is that beliefs that bear on our survival are likely to be reliably formed. But don't we still have a problem for our metaphysical and other general philosophical beliefs, since they seem not to bear on our survival? These now seem subject to defeat still, since there's no reason to consider them reliable in the light of evolution. There's a problem, however, for this more restricted line of attack against metaphysical naturalism. The problem is how implausible it seems that there are relevantly distinctive ways of forming beliefs that apply only to metaphysical or philosophical beliefs. Are there epistemic faculties that pertain to metaphysical beliefs and not at all to the more practical beliefs whereby we flourish, survive as a species? More plausibly, surely, the faculties whereby we form such beliefs, metaphysical beliefs, are the usual, including introspection, perception, memory, testimony, intuitive reason, and inference of the familiar sorts, deductive, inductive, abductive. These are the competences whereby we flourish practically, and they seem essentially the same competences whereby we flourish theoretically and philosophically. Only the subject matter is different, not our relevant epistemic competence. Moreover, there's a further doubt about the argument from evolution. Consider the proposition that, at least in the realm of contingency, at one time there was just primordial muck, or undifferentiated chaos. And let's call that thesis PM. The probability that an epistemically reliable humanity would be in place about now seems no higher conditional on PM than on E, on unguided evolution. So given the considerations adverted to a moment ago, it seems less likely that we'd be here with our epistemic competence conditional on PM. So we go back farther than evolution. Conditional on PM, it seems even less likely that we'd be here now with our epistemic competence than conditional on E, than conditional on once evolution got going. So why not appeal to unguided derivation from primordial muck rather than to unguided evolution? I hazard that atheist naturalists would tend to agree that conditional on PM, it was quite improbable that we'd be here now with our epistemic endowments. Why is this not just as much a defeater as E, and further, one whose truth naturalists are much less likely to dispute? Suppose we argued as follows. Yes, it's very improbable that we'd be here now with our epistemic competence, given the assumption of PM, primordial muck. So our emergence from that, with no benefit of guidance, our being now alive and competent with such origins, was not to be expected. How do we trump this low probability? We might say in response that our belief in our own reliability is in fact reliably formed through proper child development, so that eventually this belief dawns on us along with our Moorean common sense. But how is this belief about our dawning beliefs through child development? How is this belief properly formed? Well, we arrive at it through reflection on our own situation as we consider what we know about child development. Certain processes of belief formation plausibly lead us, all of us, not long after infancy, to such a common sense picture, the Moorean picture of the world around us. And we take these processes to be reliable. Now, how, if at all, is this line of argument different from Al's line? This new line where we dispense not with materialism, we dispense with materialism, and we now substitute an argument via primordial muck rather than evolution. So our line replaces E with PM. Aside from that, the two arguments seem parallel. So are we to suppose that our belief in PM equally defeats that we derive unguidedly from primordial muck? Are we to suppose that our belief in that equally defeats all of our beliefs beyond redemption? In our attempt to defeat this defeater, are we denied appeal to common sense and to science, to what we know about child development and scientific inquiry? Is there no way to buttress such appeal, whether through dawning child development or through Moorean bootstrapping or through mutually supportive coherence or through some such story? Will any such attempt encounter a charge of vicious circularity and of defending a source by reference to its own deliverances? Once again, the appeal to evolution seems dispensable, this time in favor of an argument that appeals instead to our unguided rise from undifferentiated chaos or primordial muck. Item G. My point here is that Al's argument falls short in a way, because there's an argument that replaces E with PM and has the same effect with premises much more easily acceptable to the naturalist. Granted, this is not a fatal objection. It cuts nowhere near the heart of the theistic position, nor even of its critique of naturalism. My point about excising references to evolution in favor of simple materialism is a similar criticism. This one seems more consequential in helping us to see how the argument depends on a reduction that is quite radical and controversial. Last I looked in philosophy of mind and philosophy of science. It depends on helping us to see how the argument depends on a reduction that's quite radical and controversial in the philosophy of mind and the philosophy of science. So I think our argument is only as strong as is one particular side in a several-sided and long-standing controversy about materialistic reduction. Ours is hence an argument for avoiding all of that problematic controversy in favor of the simpler, more defensible argument, just in terms of PM. Okay, part D, Plantingian meditations. Here in brief is a Plantinga-inspired argument that we have been considering. Item H. Naturalism eschews or rejects appeal to the supernatural and traces our origins back to blind and uncaring forces. Relative to forces, in that sense, brute, the probability that our cognitive faculties are reliable must be low, too low, which defeats any trust we may have in their reliability. Absent such trust, finally, we're deprived of epistemic justification for beliefs deriving from those faculties. But among these beliefs is the very belief in naturalism, which therefore defeats itself. So, possible naturalist reply, surely we naturalists know more about our origins than that. We know we derive from evolutionary processes that ensure our fitness to do well in our environmental niche. In response, Al invokes the epistemology of defeat. Consider the following proposition, are that one's faculties are reliable. Any belief that one is at the epistemic mercy of a demon bent on mischief, would defeat one's trust that R is true, and thereby defeat in turn the ostensible deliverances of those faculties. Similarly, once persuaded that brute forces have raised us from primordial muck, this belief also defeats one's trust in one's faculties and in turn defeats their ostensible deliverances, or so argues the anti-naturalist. But how plausible is this? Is it something specific to proposition R that might make one's belief of it susceptible to defeat? What exactly could that be? What might be the basis for the conclusion, for the assumption, that R specifically is thus susceptible to defeat? Here's a possibility. One might suppose that acceptance of a faculty's deliverances is bound to rely implicitly on the reliability of the faculty, and that this reliance takes the form of an assumption, playing the role of an implicit prior premise. Call this the implicit premise thesis. As soon as this implicit belief is put in question, then one can hardly find support for it by appeal to the ostensible deliverances of that very faculty. Such appeal would, after all, require a prior trust in the reliability of the faculty, the implicit premise postulated, and we would be in a vicious circle. So is it such reasoning that distinguishes belief that one is reliably a perceiver from belief, well, this refers to something I skipped. So we have on the one hand the belief that one is reliably a perceiver, and then one might have a belief that a smooth stone that one finds on a riverbank, that it would be a reliable roller. And the fact that one knows it came out of primordial muck through unguided processes, supposing one knows that, that wouldn't defeat one's knowledge through perception that it is a smoothly rounded stone, and one's knowledge from general background knowledge that such a stone would be a reliable roller. There wouldn't be defeat there. So there's something different that distinguishes the belief that this stone would roll reliably, is smoothly round and would roll reliably, distinguishes that from the belief that one's friends are reliable knowers through their perception, memory, etc., or that one oneself is, or especially that one oneself is a reliable knower, reliable believer of truth through one's faculties such as perception, testimony, memory, and so on. So what is it that distinguishes this latter claim, that one is a reliable knower, from the claim that the stone is a reliable roller, such that in the one case you do get the defeat, given that the entity in question has such a source from reliable muck through unguided processes? What is it that makes it the case that in the case of R you do have this defeat? Well, the proposal is maybe it's because there's a kind of vicious circularity involved in appealing to how one knows that one does have these reliable faculties, perception, testimony, memory, and so on. Maybe there would be a vicious circularity in saying, I do have these faculties, because one would, in acquiring these beliefs about these various faculties, perception, testimony, and so on, one would there be in applying the source of that belief would be these faculties that are in question, such that in exercising those faculties, one is implicitly supposing that they are reliable. So the question as to their reliability could hardly be defeated by the use of those very faculties, the ones that are under attack. Because in using them, one is postulating this implicit premise that they are reliable. That's precisely the premise that's precisely the proposition that is in question. So the idea is there's a vicious circularity involved in R, which distinguishes R from the claim of the stone and its smooth roundness and its being a reliable roller. And the difference is there's vicious circularity involved in the one case and not in the other. So how defensible, item I, is the implicit premise thesis? Compare the following three theses. R, that one's faculties are reliable. S, that the stone is rounded and reliably a roller. F, that one's friend is a reliable perceiver, colors and shapes. We're trying to understand what could possibly be epistemically distinctive of R, what might distinguish it relevantly within our present dialectic. If not on the basis of the implicit premise thesis, how might we support the required distinction between R on one hand and S and F? How to support the claim that R is subject to defeat by brute origins from primordial muck, whereas S and F are exempt from such defeat? What accounts for this distinction, if not the implicit premise thesis? Something like the implicit premise thesis may be found in Thomas Reid, where it raises subtle and difficult issues. I won't be able to take up these issues. I have a footnote in the paper where I indicate how I would take up those issues and how I have taken up those issues in a book called Reflective Knowledge. But I won't go into that here. But the long and short is I don't think that the implicit premise thesis is really a problem. So I don't believe that the foregoing line of argument can be successful, the one that identifies what's distinctive about R as the fact that once defeated, it cannot be defended without vicious circularity. Once you allow that there's this defeat from the low probability of its being given its origins way back, that in the case of R, you cannot defeat that defeater because you'd be involved in a vicious circularity. So we can go into it in the discussion, but I don't think I think the implicit premise thesis falls short, either because we make no such assumption, there's no such postulation, even implicitly, of any such thesis when we use our faculties, as we do, in attaining our knowledge that we're endowed with perception, memory, etc., and that these are reliable, either because we make no such implicit assumption, or because, even if in some sense we do, at least implicitly make such an assumption, doing so need involve no vicious circularity. There'll be a kind of circle, but the question is whether it is really vicious. And that's what I argue in the earlier work is not so. So that brings us to more promising reasoning in terms of what I call reflective knowledge. How might the requirements for reflective knowledge offer better support for the case against naturalism? Reflective knowledge requires underwriting the knower's belief through her own epistemic perspective. And now it can be argued that the naturalist, unlike the theist, is denied such a perspective and is hence at an epistemic disadvantage. Is the naturalist ill-positioned to attain reflective knowledge, which requires, again, taking this reflective stance on one's own epistemic situation and endorsing it appropriately? Is he denied the possibility of doing so, the naturalist, of such appropriate endorsement? Is he in a self-defeating position in this regard? How implausible this is, I think, may be seen as follows. Item J. As a supernaturalist, one might use certain faculties, as does Descartes, his faculties of a priori reflection, in devising an epistemically comforting view of one's own universe, so that one can endorse one's own epistemic situation. According to this epistemically comforting view, one is so constituted and so related to one's world that one's faculties would be truth conducive, not misleading. I take that to be Descartes' strategy via God. What denies such a strategy to the naturalist? Why can't you, as a naturalist, develop a view of yourself, your surroundings, your faculties, your perception, your memory, and so on, that shows your situation to be epistemically propitious? You would need to be able to self-attribute ways of acquiring and retaining beliefs that would tend to yield beliefs that are true. What precludes your doing so by means of science as a naturalist if the supernaturalist, say Descartes, can do so by means of theology? So here now is a key question about the Plantingian strategy under review. Is there any proposition N integral to naturalism whose inclusion in a view V would spoil V's prospects for constituting reflective knowledge, so that V, because of its inclusion of N, would not be the sort of view that could properly be endorsed by the holder of V? That because it includes N, V is precluded from proper reflective endorsement. In other words, would any view V that contained N be precluded thereby from being coherently enriched so as to enable holders of V, the enriched V, to become thereby reflective knowers with proper perspectival endorsement? I myself can see no bright prospect for showing that the following would be such a proposition N, that we humans derive through brute forces from primordial muck. That proposition is tenable compatibly with the following complex view, that we are good cognizers of our surroundings through our use of vision, hearing, etc., that these faculties put us reliably enough in touch with the truth about empirical and contingent goings-on around us, and that we are thereby enabled to know about these goings-on. Issues of circularity do arise as to how we can rationally and knowledgeably adopt such a view about our own epistemic powers. But these problems of circularity are not exclusive to naturalism, as Descartes was soon to find out from his critics. Consider any subject who faces the question whether her faculties are reliable, and realizes that if she does have reliable faculties, this is a contingent matter. She cannot, and that she cannot just assume that she does and let it go at that. given the contingency of the reliability of her faculties, what assures her that though they might have been unreliable, in fact, they are reliable? Wouldn't the inability to give a rational, non-arbitrary answer to this question itself constitute a problem? Item K, compare your situation as a naturalist, facing the fact that your faculties derive through brute forces from primordial muck. If you agree that you and your faculties are so derived, does this not defeat your belief in your cognitive reliability? Suppose you try through your faculties to attain a picture of yourself and the world around you, offering assurance that your faculties are reliable despite their brute derivation. Is this to proceed circularly? Well, it is to proceed in a kind of circle. Will it be said that the circle is vicious? Yes, that has often been said, since Descartes at least, no doubt will be repeated. But such a circle cannot possibly be avoided. Once we face so fundamental a question, how then can it really be vicious? That would presumably mean that to proceed accordingly is wrong or faulty or flawed. But once we face the question and we try to answer it, the circle is unavoidable. Is it then wrong or flawed or faulty to so much as face the question, given the inevitable upshot? How in sum should we respond to Plantinga's anti-naturalist meditations? If our faculties are brutally derived, their reliability does indeed seem low relative to that. Even so, this defeats our belief in the reliability of our faculties only if we have no other basis for believing them to be reliable. We do have another basis, though, beyond anything we may believe about the etiology of our faculties from primordial muck. Their own deliverances, after all, provide such a basis. And what more specifically is this basis? Is it the mere fact that our faculties are self-supportive and yield belief in their own reliability? No, that cannot suffice on its own. Obviously, superstitious faculties might easily share that property of being self-endorsing with little epistemic effect. At a minimum, our faculties must satisfy an additional condition. Not only must they be self-supportive, that is, productive of a picture of the believer and his world, according to which those very faculties are reliable, not only must they do that much, in addition, they must be, in fact, reliable. Item L. Suppose, as argued earlier, that a theist who offers the ignorance defense against evil must then declare the probability of R on theism to be either low, perhaps around 0.5, or else inscrutable, which provides a defeater of our belief in R. Such a theist is then under pressure to avoid the coal pit of skepticism in some way other than simply through his theism. And he may thereby turn more receptive to the notion that there are important disanalogies, where earlier he had seen only clear analogies. For the sort of disanalogy that I have in mind, consider the contrast between gauges and perceptual organs such as eyes and ears. Gauges on the one hand, perceptual organs on the other. We must eventually, through infancy, adolescence, later learning, we must acquire through some sort of learning our right to trust the various gauges that we end up trusting. But it is hopeless to suppose that we must equally acquire a right to trust our senses through learning. It seems rather that there's some minimal set of basic faculties involving perceptual organs and senses, memory, testimony, reasoning, some minimal set such that we cannot acquire a right to trust the deliverances of any of them without at least implicitly trusting the others, at least concurrently, logically, and or temporally. Gauges would seem not to figure the way organs do in that minimal set. Their right to be trusted must be earned through proper ratiocinative learning. Why so? What gives a faculty or an organ a place in that minimal set? Here's a start on an answer to that question. Our focus here is on human knowledge and its limits. And the minimal set is the set on which normal humans already in the Stone Age converge. our communities have and need eyes, ears, testimony, memory, reasoning, language. Some of us, once we advance technologically, will eventually exploit gauges, instruments more generally, etc. But our trust in these is acquired in the history of the human race and in the life of the individual members. Our trust in these gauges is acquired only through the use of the epistemic items in the restricted set, none of which has ever been absent entirely from our communities, and none of which arguably could have been so absent without epistemic disaster, given the contingencies of how we can collectively access the facts that we need in order to flourish and even to survive. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Sosa, very much. Well, as we did earlier, I'd like the discussion at this point to be relatively brief, to be friendly and interpretive. If you have questions about, again, how to characterize what Professor...
When do we get a response from Al?
Yes, and what we'll do is we'll have this kind of discussion that I've just described. We'll have lunch. Right after lunch, Al has actually prepared a response to Professor Sosa's response, which he'll give, as I say, right after lunch.
Don't worry, it's short.
So again, at this point, I don't want to get into the merits of the argument so much as talking about how to characterize it. So yeah, Michael and Megan.
Yeah, I hope this will be regarded as an interpretive question. It's sort of point L here on your handout where you refer to a minimal set of basic faculties involving perceptual organs, senses, memory, testimony, reasoning, and so on, right? Do you want to reject sort of what we might call a strong foundationalism, which says that give me direct awareness of present mental states and give me, some would say inference, the best explanation. I'd prefer to say reasoning involving logical probability, and I'll get all the rest. That is, I'll get to be able to show that inference, the best explanation, gets you to knowledge of the external world. Again, inference, best explanation based on a variety of memories that one has and so forth and so on, will get you to the existence of past objects. Probabilistic reasoning will get you to a justification of induction, a la Bayes or David Stove and so on. I mean, are you ruling out that sort of...
Yeah, I guess we need to get into the issue of what directness means. If it means non-inferential, then that seems quite plausible to me. If it has some stronger meaning than just non-inferential, then we need to see what the content of that stronger meaning is. And my suspicion is that I'm going to be still skeptical if the stronger content for directness doesn't import some kind of reliability. That it's really competence or reliability that's going to be doing the epistemic work. It's just that now we're hopeful we can do it by starting out with direct but competent access to certain subject matter to which we have this special access.
I was thinking just as non-inferential.
Oh, well then, I mean, then perception, would come in, everything.
Let's...
Okay, then we need to go into, does perception involve inference? And yeah, okay.
Megan, and then we'll have Louise and Steve.
I had a question about how you reconstructed the evolutionary argument against naturalism and the skeptical theism arguments in just the very beginning of the presentation. And you say you want R to stand for the proposition that our cognitive faculties are reliable, but this seems far too sweeping for R if you're going to accurately reconstruct those arguments, because skeptical theists don't deny that our basic perceptual faculties are reliable. They're mostly focused on whether or not our moral faculties or higher order ethical faculties are reliable. Likewise, the naturalist target of Al's argument isn't committed to a kind of global skepticism, just a kind of skepticism about their ability to know truths about metaphysics or higher order philosophical claims or higher order scientific claims. So it seems like your R should be more relative. R should be the proposition that our cognitive faculties, higher order cognitive, philosophical, ethical, atheological, value theory faculties are reliable, not just cognitive faculties. But then I get a little bit confused, and this isn't meant to be an objection yet, but E, you say there's this, E supposes that there is this contemporary scientific theory of evolution that provides an account of the relevant cognitive faculties. And if what we're talking about are these higher order metaphysical, theological, atheological, philosophical, mathematical faculties. As far as I can tell, there is no such contemporary scientific theory. I mean, even evolutionary psychology, they're still barely making inroads at explaining behaviors like basic altruism. Forget about explaining how we could possibly have a reliable metaphysical faculty. One of the big questions is whether or not, in fact, we are reliable when we come to these metaphysical views. So I think that when you set up the argument the right way with like the appropriately qualified R, these arguments look very bad, but that shouldn't be particularly embarrassing to naturalists or to theists, because neither camp really has a theory of how we could develop higher order cognitive faculties to begin with, so there's no target. So the second part of that's mostly an objection. The first part's whether you want R to be much more narrow.
I think I meant to be just following Al here. I think Al's claim, Al's claim is more sweeping than just the restricted claim about philosophical faculties. But I did take up the issue of restriction, and my problem there was I don't see that the faculties that are pertinent to philosophical reflection are distinctive. They're just, the same normal competences that we use even in making our way in a daily.
There's an interesting question of whether or not we can give like a theory of that, of like how being appropriately good at metaphysics or theology or higher level value theory.
You're right.
could
You're right.
actually-
That's an assumption.
Louise.
Ernie, I was wondering about your point about the implicit premise. So I wasn't sure if, so you say one might suppose that the acceptance of a faculty's deliverances is bound to rely implicitly on the reliability of the faculty, yes, and that this reliance takes the form of an assumption playing the role of an implicit prior premise. Now, I wasn't sure in the end whether you wanted to endorse that second step or not. It seems to me that we always want to distinguish the conditions, the satisfaction of which are required for a certain piece of reasoning to be cogent, distinguish that from a belief that those conditions are satisfied. And that's as true of non-deductive reasoning as is true of deductive reasoning. We can see what the problem is when we look at deductive reasoning. It's the problem of Achilles and the tortoise. You can make all the inference steps explicit as premises if you want, but there still has to be in place the logical relations among the premises and conclusions for the argument to be cogent, and no amount of extracting claims that that's the case is going to suffice if you think there's something necessary. So I wondered whether you were endorsing the implicit premise or whether you were just sort of putting this forward as a something to consider for the sake of argument.
In the end, I don't endorse it. I say we can reject the supposed problem either by rejecting, as you just have, the implicit premise, or by accepting it and saying the circle is not vicious. There will be a circle, but it's not vicious. So.
Steve.
Actually, my question was almost the exact same question, but I can do a quick follow-up, including I was going to make the same reference to Achilles and the tortoise. So, but so yeah, so
Great minds.
So I completely get the. So you put it sort of disjunctively in your remarks that, well, look, and just now also, well, either you just distinguish, rule circularity from premise circularity, just no problem with rule circularity. Or you just allow that you have this implicit premise, but then you say the circle's not vicious. And I'm very attracted to the first disjunct. That seems to be the clear thing to say. And I wasn't sure how that second thing would go, and you said there's more in other writings of yours. And I wonder if there's a brief thing you can say about how you can actually allow that there is this premise here, and yet it still isn't, it's still not a vicious circle.
Right. The thing that seems clear is we don't have to consciously entertain and affirm the statement of the rule when we apply the rule. But you might say in drawing the conclusion from these premises, you are in effect showing that you accept the corresponding conditional of the inference. You're showing through your behavior that you accept it. I mean, there's lots of beliefs that we have and show that we have through our conduct, sometimes even despite the explicit denial that we have that belief. I mean, biases and prejudices would be cases in point. So if you're sympathetic to that view of belief, where it doesn't have to be consciously endorsed, then you might say, okay, there's a kind of implicit belief that's involved in accepting, in exercising these faculties, in drawing these inferences, for example. But then the point would be, well, but that doesn't need to be vicious, because it would have to be vicious if you now needed further. That it might be that the status of these implicit beliefs, which are constitutive of the possession of the faculties, the status of them is a status that they get simply through their presence in the restricted, charmed circle of basic faculties, and that humans need in order to get along. So that their status derives from their essential presence in the minimal constitution that we need in order to flourish.
Okay. So would this be a way of putting part of what you just said, that, okay, good, we could grant that the person implicitly believes it. By implicit belief, it just means they accept this rule of reasoning, and it's the corresponding conditional. But one can accept all that without ever saying that this implicit belief is actually a premise, that is a reason at all. So therefore, it's not vicious. It's just another way of putting the rule circularity. Okay.
Trent?
This really is interpretive. Here's one question. What explains, or what's the account of why I'm rational or warranted to believe that my cognitive faculties are reliable? And here's a different question. What would count as a good defeater for a defeater for the defeater, for a defeater for my belief that my cognitive faculties are reliable? And those are two, I think, very different questions. I wasn't clear if, it sounded to me like most of what you were saying when you talk about either the Moynihan bootstrapping or the childhood development or the faculties are self-supporting and moreover reliable, most of that felt to me like a, so I guess my first question is, so I gotta be careful not to make an objection. First question was, is all of that stuff meant to explain sort of initially why I'm rational believing my cognitive faculties are reliable? And all that seems plausible and good to me. Or is it, but not really relevant to Al's argument, or is it instead meant to be a way to defeat a defeater for the belief of my own reliability? And there, it strikes me as less plausible, but clearly relevant. And I wasn't really sure which of those two you were mainly doing.
Yeah. So basically, I was granting the idea that there is defeat for the sake of argument.
Yeah.
But I'm not really clear that there is defeat. And really now we get into the issue of what exactly is involved in defeat. And maybe later today we'll get into pressing Al for an account of what's involved in defeat. So, because, for example, if you think of defeat as a defeating proposition is one which, when added to your body of beliefs or your noetic structure, it would have the following effect, that you would not be able properly to continue to believe as you do the thing that's being defeated. And why would you not be able properly to continue? Well, because your design, either your epistemic design or your broader design, wouldn't permit you to continue. If you're properly designed, you just wouldn't continue to believe. Now, what is proper epistemic design? What is proper design? Proper design in general presumably would relate to flourishing more generally. Proper epistemic design would presumably relate to, that is, the part of your constitution, your mental constitution, that is designed for proper epistemic functioning, presumably would be that part of your mental constitution that yields beliefs and yields mostly true beliefs, a preponderance of true beliefs, as Al puts it. But now, if we think of it that way, then it's not so clear that adding this thing makes it the case that you now would not, if you're properly designed and properly functioning, still believe all the things that you believed before. Because after all, by believing those things, it may be, is how you get a preponderance of true beliefs, and indeed any true beliefs.
Yeah, that's a different point though than what you're mostly. I thought you were mostly. So now you're kind of saying maybe there's no defeater there at all.
Correct.
Right?
So I was
But
leaving
here
that
I
open.
thought you were doing something else, trying to give a defeater.
No, I was granting it for the sake of argument, though I have my doubts that there is real defeat. So granting it for this argument, then the issue turns to, okay, well, can we defeat the defeater? Supposing that there is defeat, although that might be questionable. And now the question would be, how would you defeat the defeater? And the considerations, I think, that make it plausible, once having assumed that there is defeat at all, the considerations that make it plausible that you can appeal to something in defeating that defeater are the same basic considerations as the considerations that would enable you to, I think, that would enable you to object to the idea that there is defeat in the first place.
Thank you. Yeah, okay, yeah, very quick, and then very quick from Nick.
Can there be partial defeat? I mean, why is defeat a matter of all or nothing? You get some testimony, and then you get some evidence that the person is not as reliable as you thought they are. You don't have to just stop believing altogether. You should maybe just decrement your confidence a little bit.
Yeah, that seems right.
Ernie, small point. There's on what's implicit in allowing our faculties to work. There's one line of thought in Reed which says it's not really implicit premises. They don't function like premises. There's also a line of thought which says they aren't even really beliefs. They're takings for granted. Now, Reed doesn't explain what it is to take something for granted, and nobody else that I know of has ever succeeded in explaining what it is to take something for granted. But it seems to me that really to illuminate what's going on here, we'd have to have some account of taking for granted.
Yeah, that seems right.
Now, your argument
Yeah.
goes straight through. Either we don't take these crucial things for granted, okay, or we do, and it's utterly harmless and perfectly okay to do so.
Yeah. He has a very interesting word that's that then makes it very difficult to be clear in interpreting him. The word principles.
Yes.
What are principles?
Yeah,
Sometimes they're
yeah.
faculty, sometimes they're propositions.
Well, thank you, Professor Sosa, Professor Flanagan, for introducing us to the complexities and the nuances of this very difficult set of issues.